America, the land of opportunity. A country whose founders declared their belief that all are created equal. A land where all are welcome and free to pursue their dreams. But many of the people who labored hard to build this country were excluded from its benefits. Native Americans, who welcomed the early European settlers and shared knowledge of survival in the New World, were massacred and driven from their ancestral lands. Africans, brought here against their will, were sold into slavery to provide free labor in the homes and fields of their white owners. Asian immigrants provided much of the backbreaking labor to build this country's infrastructure, but were paid only a fraction of the wages of their white co-workers, denied citizenship, and frequently victims of mob violence. Hispanics also have endured their share of racism and cultural prejudice, and have often been relegated to doing menial work for meager wages. Our nation's prosperity was and continues to be fueled by many who have seen little of the fruits of that prosperity. All too often, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, and other minorities are segregated into communities of concentrated poverty, with little access to avenues towards a better life.
The founding fathers of this country felt that the European expansionism into the New World was almost a God-given right. They were coming into a new land that flowed milk and honey, and the new land that flowed milk and honey was the Americas, and God was giving them this land. That's how they justified slavery. That's how they justified Native American genocide.
In 1619, slaves, African slaves, came for the first time to the Virginia colonies, to Jamestown. So here come Africans to this country as property. To that extent, the relationship between economy and race was evident, was paramount. I mean, blacks had no liberty or independence of their own. They were chattel slaves, and whites owned them for their economic benefit. So race and poverty were really conjoined in that first act.
Some people will say that it was racism that caused slavery, and I think it's actually the other way around, that it was actually the economic necessity of slavery that caused racism. So you have people in a Christian nation who identify as Christians who are enslaving others and taking them as slaves, and it creates a moral tension because you're saying, well, I consider myself a good person, I consider myself a Christian, and yet I'm treating other human beings as slaves and as property. So there has to be some sort of rationalization has to come into play, which has to say that if I'm doing this, it's either because I'm a bad person, or it's because for some reason this is how things are supposed to be. You know, these people are fit for slavery, or they're not fully human, so that psychological tension can be resolved. And of course it can't ever be fully resolved, but it allows you to say that, well, I'm not really doing anything wrong, or this is just the way the world is supposed to be, so it has to be something wrong with them.
We didn't come here to participate in society. We came here to serve economic interest. We were dehumanized. Legally, we were called chattel, pieces of property. So that's a clear root of racism. And I think that even today, the legacy of that beginning continues to have effect.
Slavery is a critical factor in determining who ends up where in the social structure today. Slavery took a terrible toll on the black family. It's white people that denied black people in this country the right to form long-term, permanent, stable families. Mothers and fathers, husbands and wives, men and women were sold away from each other. Their children were ripped away from them, sold off to one plantation and off to another plantation, so that in fact the integrity of the black family was sacrificed to the economic needs of profit and property.
When slavery ended, there was every effort to keep people in their place so that the economic system in the South particularly could continue to be supported by free or very inexpensive labor. And the opportunities for people to escape from that system were very limited. And I think over the next 100 years, as people tried to change and get out of that system, they didn't have the opportunity, either by training, education, or income, to move very far.
Working class neighborhoods at the turn of the century were much more racially integrated than they are today. I think that's important to remember, because the political discussion that we've had over the past 30 years is that racial segregation has always been here. And of course, there is a lot of racial segregation that we've had historically. But we also started to break down racial segregation. It started to happen on its own as people followed jobs. But as people followed jobs and as communities began to integrate, particularly working class communities, a series of federal policies, as well as state and local, literally segregated those communities.
The government deliberately excluded providing loans to blacks to move to the suburbs. The FHA underwriting manual suggested that one of the criteria for lending was that you have no inharmonious elements within a neighborhood. Inharmonious elements was translated into black people moving into white neighborhoods. So redlining, you've heard the term, became an official policy of the United States.
President Roosevelt set up a homeowners loan corporation to help people afford to buy housing. Buying housing is one criterion for establishing both middle-class status and an important wealth asset that you can pass on to your children that helps keep them out of poverty. So for a working class person to own a home was an extremely important avenue out of poverty and a way of maintaining the future generations. Well, what happened was the Homeowners Loan Corporation basically said any neighborhood with black people in it, even if it's only a small number of black people, is too risky.
Folks in those parts of town didn't get the opportunity in the 30s or 40s or 50s or even 1960s to put $4,000 down on a $50,000 home and pay over time. Once again, it's not surprising that in the year 2000, you look at home ownership, you look at the accumulation of equity, and see that African Americans still lag substantially behind whites. Those are the persisting vestiges of this system that was expressly racially hostile for hundreds of years.
We have a society that intentionally segregated neighborhoods by race. Now, obviously, at some point in our society, some blacks had the resources to leave poor communities within the cities. But what happens is you have schools that are financed largely through local tax base. So when you have segregation, and particularly segregation that results in isolated, low-income communities, poor people all living together in concentrated poverty, there's no tax base to support that school system.
And of course, America is supposed to be the land of opportunity, and for many it has been the land of opportunity. But the key ingredient is our belief that you can take any child and give that child the opportunity to succeed, and they'll do as well or as poorly as their own character and their hard work permits. But the opportunity in our society comes largely through public education. And public education is radically different in different communities and in different school districts, and a lot of those are characterized by race. And it's no surprise when one looks that the communities with very low levels of funding tend to be minority communities.
I was fortunate. We lived in a low-income black neighborhood in Washington, D.C., but we were a middle-class family. I mean, both my parents had college degrees and both my parents had graduate school degrees, as well as the fact that, we weren't poor. We actually had a decent house and enough space to roam around in and health care. But I went to the neighborhood public school. The neighborhood public school, being in a concentrated poverty community, black neighborhood, it was all black. Almost all the children in my school, except for me, were on welfare. We had 1 year in second grade, I had 6 different teachers in 1 year. We had overcrowded classrooms. We had no facilities. And so while I had all the advantages of being a middle-class person in this society, I tested 2 years behind grade level by 3rd grade.
Think of almost anything that the country values, and whether it's material or opportunity and experience, and the kid in the concentrated poverty has little access to that.
Right now, the rules of our society are facially neutral. They don't make many formal racial classifications and say blacks may not, Latinos may not. In a sense, the system operates far more subtly, but to some extent, therefore, far more injuriously, because you don't even know when you've been hit.
We have a cycle of poverty that operates in our society. Certain people are less well educated, so they get less desirable jobs. The jobs pay less, which gives them less resources to use when they look for housing. So they end up with housing in poor and deteriorating neighborhoods with less access to health care and with schools that are significantly below average in terms of the ability to educate children. So their children go to those schools and get a poor education. So when they graduate from those schools and they look for jobs, they get less desirable jobs at a lower rate of pay, which consigns them back to those poor neighborhoods where their children will go to those same schools, probably still using the same textbooks, and the cycle goes on. It's very hard to break out of that cycle of poverty. And people's lives then become shaped and determined and limited by economic factors largely beyond their control.
Certainly it's true that there are white people who are poor, so poverty isn't just a racial problem. But it's not a coincidence that a lot of the cities that have people of color and majority populations of people of color, that they happen to be the poorest places. You can't get around the fact that there is definitely a connection between racism and economic deprivation and poverty, no question about that.
Our whole society is really tainted by racism in a way that keeps people away from equal opportunity. And that racism is not just simply what's in my heart or someone else's heart. That racism is really now a part of our institutions and our organization as a society.
It's an institutionalized set of policies, practices, advantages, and disadvantages. And in this society, those policies and practices and those institutions, in fact, benefit white people.
If you assume that certain folks don't have as much value as others, then of course you will distribute your resources accordingly, and you will make sure that those who are supposed to be the good folks and the powerful folks, that they get much of what there is to get.
When I was diagnosed with breast cancer, I was about 41 at the time. I had two small children, a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old, and it was a very terrible thing. I was teaching a women's studies class, and I was looking through a book that had statistics about women's lives. And a short time after I was diagnosed with my cancer, I came upon a statistic which said that African American women who were diagnosed with breast cancer on the same day as a white woman were much less likely to be alive 5 years later. I think the white woman had a 41% greater chance of being alive, of surviving her cancer. Because of my whiteness and because of my class background, I had a better chance of surviving my cancer than an African American sister diagnosed on the same day. And that seemed very unfair. It had nothing to do with any choice I made. I certainly don't want any other woman to suffer from cancer or die from it. But it's an example of the way in which we have these privileges, not because we choose to have them, but because race, class, and gender define every part of people's lives. They're built into the system.
Whenever suburbs say, not in my backyard, I don't want those, you know. And people will say, oh, it's not because they're black, it's because, look, you put this building, they're all poor, they're going to come here, and we're going to have this crime problem. You know, the reality is you think that because you have a stereotype of what has happened in highly concentrated poor communities. If you highly concentrate anybody by poverty, regardless of their race, you're going to have more crime. You're going to have more drug addiction. And why is that? You're not going to have opportunities. You're going to have a very high percentage of the population unemployed because jobs are not located in those communities. They're not going to be able to get a lot of jobs because their educational system is so poor, they're not highly skilled. Low-skilled jobs have moved to the suburbs. Because transportation has been created to connect white suburbanites to, you know, business districts within cities, not to connect poor neighborhoods to jobs in the suburbs, you probably don't have any easy way to get to the suburb from your inner city community to take advantage of even a low-wage, no-benefit job.
I think we've continued to be happy allowing those folks that we identify as different to be in communities that don't interact with us. And we have developed a whole mythology around it, I think, of fear and resentment of people that we have decided need to be in a different place than we are.
Anybody that you put in that circumstance, if you put white people in that circumstance, they're going to have high crime, they're going to have high drug rates, they're going to have high, you know, teenage pregnancy rates. You're going to have all the social ills that you incubate when you isolate people from opportunity, when you isolate people from any meaningful way to improve their lives, and when you isolate them from basic services that they need to help get them on track. And that's what we've done. And in doing that, once we've done it, once we've isolated people, then we say, how come you can't pull yourself up by your bootstraps? They don't have any bootstraps.
I fear that a large segment of our society has been rendered expendable, extremely marginalized, and that's where the intersection of race and poverty is drastic, and it's, I think, the biggest challenge right now for the country, even though insufficient attention is being paid. These people literally are forgotten. I guess literally expendable, you know.
Racism refers to a system of advantages that are interwoven, built into the society, that privilege white people and disadvantage people of color. Anybody can discriminate, and anybody can be prejudiced. A person of color can be prejudiced, a Latino person can be prejudiced against white people, an Asian person can be prejudiced against white people, but only white people can be racist. because racism refers to the system of institutionalized advantage and disadvantage.
In this country, the people with the money and power have been white, and they have been able to give benefits, economic and otherwise, to their children that people of color don't have the ability to give to their children and haven't had the ability to give to their children for generations. And so we continue to kind of preserve a system which puts people of color at disadvantage while continue to provide an advantage for those who are white.
I'm 55 years old. I grew up in North Carolina. That means everyone of my age who was black went to a separate school. Their parents were not permitted employment, even in the cotton mills. They were permitted only day labor or domestic labor. It's no surprise that people my age, the children of those folks raised in that situation, still bear the disabilities of that disadvantage. Everyone can think about their own parents and say, did they give me anything? Did I get financial benefit? Did I get educational benefits from them? If the answer to those questions is yes, I can tell you the answer for African Americans is different.
People in power look at white people as colleagues and as friends and as people that share values. And they look at people of color as different, as other, and as folks that can't really be trusted. That, I think, has become a part of our society over centuries so that we're not even aware that we do it.
White people have enjoyed white privilege for so long, simply no longer recognize it. It's like the fish. There was a famous article written by Sandra and Darrell Bem years ago that talked about sexism. And they began by posing a question. They said, what's the one thing that the fish doesn't know? And the answer was that it's all wet, right? What's the one thing that white people don't get? White privilege.
And if you recognize that it's privilege and not just solely the result of, say, your own hard work or your own moral character, then maybe you can get past that idea of, well, anyone who's not receiving that privilege is somehow morally deficient or not working hard enough. And then I think if you can get past that, then you can start to say, well, I do believe in justice.
It's not enough to deplore racism. Those of us who are white and who benefit from white privilege need to look at the ways in which we benefit. And then we have to try to do things which somehow remedy that imbalance.
It's not simply a matter of my being able to love my individual neighbor who may be different, but to be willing to say that we need to begin to look at how we make policy in this country and how we pass laws and how we establish ourselves as a community in which everyone does have access to the same opportunity.